The lights in Station Epsilon 7's cantina flickered with the usual power surges that came with deep space trading posts. Smoke from various alien substances drifted through the air, mixing scents that would make most humans sick, but created the perfect atmosphere for beings from dozens of different worlds. The cantina buzzed with conversation in languages that sounded like everything from musical chimes to grinding metal. At a corner table sat Zeth Kar, his massive frame hunched over a drink that glowed blue in the dim light. His species, the Vorthak, were known throughout the galaxy as fierce warriors. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with thick armored skin and 4 arms, they had built their reputation on conquest and honor in battle. But Zeth Kar looked different from the proud warriors his kind usually produced. His left arm had been replaced with crude metal and wires. Where his left eye should have been, a red mechanical device blinked and whirred as it focused. Deep scars ran across his face and neck, telling stories of battles that had pushed him to the very edge of death. Other patrons in the cantina gave him space, sensing something dangerous about the old warrior even in his quiet state. Near the center of the room, a group of younger aliens had gathered around several tables pushed together. They wore the bright uniforms of various military academies and spoke loudly about their training and future plans for glory. Their voices carried easily across the cantina, full of the confidence that came from never having faced real combat. The UR Ceylani fleet will expand into the Outer Rim systems within 5 years, declared Vex Moore, a sleek reptilian creature with silver scales that caught the light as he gestured. Those human colonies won't even know what hit them. Their technology is so primitive compared to ours. His companions laughed and agreed. A young Krex officer with multiple eyes spread across his broad head nodded enthusiastically. My instructors say humans have only been in space for 300 years. We've been conquering worlds for 3,000. It would be like adults fighting children. I heard their ships are made mostly of metal and simple electronics, added a female Vorthak cadet, her forearms moving as she spoke. No quantum shielding, no plasma cores, no neural interface systems. They still use projectile weapons in some cases. Projectile weapons, can you imagine? The group burst into laughter again. Several other patrons turned to look at them, some with amusement, others with annoyance at the noise. But Zeth Kar's reaction was different. His mandibles clicked together slowly, creating a sound that his species made when they found something darkly funny. The mechanical eye whirred as it focused on the young aliens. Primitive, he repeated quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. The words seemed to hang in the air. The young officers noticed the interruption and turned toward his table. Vexmore's scales shifted to a more aggressive pattern. Did you say something, old one? Zeth Kar took another sip of his drink before responding. You called humans primitive. It brought back memories. Memories of what? Asked the young Vorthak female, her tone suggesting she expected another war story from an aging veteran trying to impress youngsters. Of the last time someone said those exact words. Zeth Kar's mechanical eye focused on each of them in turn. It was Admiral Korvthak of the 7th Fleet, right before he ordered the assault on human space, right before the siege of Kepler 442b. Several aliens at nearby tables stopped their conversations. The name of that battle was known throughout the galaxy, though the details were often kept classified. It had been one of the bloodiest conflicts in recent history, and very few who had participated ever spoke about it openly. You were at Kepler 442b? The Krex officer's multiple eyes widened. That was 15 years ago. The report said it was a complete victory for our forces. Zeth Kar's mandibles clicked again, but this time the sound was bitter. A victory. Yes, that's what the report said. They had to say something to explain why 3 of the galaxy's most powerful military forces needed 2 years to conquer a single human agricultural world. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across their table. The mechanical arm whirred as servos adjusted his balance. Would you like to know what really happened at Kepler 442b? Would you like to know why your instructors teach you about human primitiveness but never assign actual combat missions in their space? The young aliens exchanged glances. This was clearly not going to be the usual old soldier's tale of glory and easy victories. But their curiosity had been awakened, and backing down now would seem cowardly in front of their peers. "Tell us," said Vexmore, trying to keep the challenge in his voice despite growing unease. Zethkar moved to their table, pulling up a chair that groaned under his weight. "It started exactly as you described. 3 Allied fleets representing the most advanced military forces in the galaxy. The Vorthak Dominion contributed 200 ships and 50,000 ground troops. The Zelani fleet brought their newest dreadnoughts and their best pilots. The Krex hierarchy provided their famous battle computers and tactical analysis systems." He paused to drink, letting the numbers sink in. "Our target was a human colony world with a population of 8 million, mostly farmers, engineers, and their families. Their military presence consisted of a small orbital defense platform and maybe a dozen patrol ships. Our intelligence reports said they had no significant ground forces and would likely surrender once they saw the size of our fleet." "That sounds like a reasonable assessment," the young Vorthak cadet said carefully. "It was reasonable," Zethkar agreed. "Based on everything we knew about warfare, based on 3,000 years of conquering worlds across the galaxy, based on the assumption that all intelligent species approach conflict in roughly the same way." His mechanical eye whirred as it adjusted focus. "The first sign that something was different came when we dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of their system. Standard procedure is to send a surrender demand and wait for their response. Usually takes a few hours while the local government debates and panics. What happened instead? Their response came in 30 seconds. A single word broadcast on all frequencies. No." Zethkar's voice carried a mixture of respect and old fear. "Not, 'We need time to consider,' or 'What are your terms,' or any of the usual negotiating positions. Just no." The cantina had grown quieter as other patrons strained to listen. Stories from Kepler 442b were rare, and most who had been there preferred not to discuss the experience. "Admiral Korvthak was actually amused," Zethkar continued. "He ordered the fleet to advance to the inner system and demonstrate our firepower by destroying a few empty orbital stations, a show of force to make them reconsider." "A standard tactic," agreed the Krex officer. "Yes, standard." Zethkar's mandibles clicked slowly. What wasn't standard was what happened next. As we approached the planet, we detected energy signatures that didn't match our intelligence reports. Lots of them. The humans had been busy during the months it took us to assemble our invasion force. He leaned forward, his voice dropping but remaining clearly audible. They had turned their entire agricultural and industrial infrastructure into weapons manufacturing. Farms were producing military-grade explosives using fertilizer and farming chemicals. Factories that made construction equipment were now building tanks and artillery. Orbital grain elevators had been converted into missile launchers. "Impossible," protested Vexmore. "You can't convert civilian infrastructure for military use that quickly. The logistics alone would take years." "That's what we thought too," Zethkar replied. "That's what 3,000 years of military experience told us. But humans don't follow the rules that the rest of us learned. They don't separate military and civilian thinking the way we do. When they decided to fight, everything became a weapon." The mechanical eye focused on the young Zelani. "Your people pride yourselves on being able to adapt quickly to changing battle conditions. How long does it take your fastest pilots to adjust their tactics when facing an unexpected enemy formation?" "Minutes, maybe seconds for the best pilots," Vexmore answered with pride. "Humans were adapting their entire planetary defense strategy in real time," Zethkar said quietly. "Not just pilots or individual units, but their whole population. As we watched from orbit, we could see new defensive positions being built, supply lines being rerouted, civilian evacuation routes being converted into military transportation networks. It was like watching an entire world transform itself into a weapon pointed at us." The young aliens sat in silence processing this information. Their military training had taught them about logistics, strategy, and tactics, but always within the framework of established military hierarchies and standard operating procedures. That still doesn't explain how they could defeat superior numbers and technology, the young Vorthak cadet said finally. Zethkar finished his drink and set the empty container down with a metallic clink. That's where the real story begins. The first ground assault landed near their capital city, expecting to face disorganized civilian militias with hunting weapons and improvised defenses. His mechanical eye dimmed slightly, as if the memory was too painful to focus on clearly. Instead, we met Captain Jake Morrison and the 1st Colonial Defense Regiment, and that's when we learned our first lesson about human warfare. The next evening, the young alien officers found themselves back at the same cantina, though they hadn't planned to meet there. Each had spent the day thinking about Zethkar's words, unable to focus on their regular duties. The old warriors' tale had left too many questions unanswered, and the mystery gnawed at them like an itch they couldn't scratch. Zethkar arrived exactly 1 hour after sunset, as if he had expected them to return. He ordered the same glowing blue drink and settled into his chair without greeting them. The mechanical parts of his body made small whirring sounds as he adjusted his position, reminders of whatever had happened to him during that long-ago battle. "You want to know about Captain Jake Morrison?" he said without looking at them directly. It wasn't a question. "You said he taught you about human warfare," replied the young Vorthak cadet, whose name was Kethara. "What did you mean?" Zethkar's organic eye focused on her while the mechanical one continued to scan the room. Morrison commanded 12 ships, old ones, built for cargo transport and converted for military use. Our fleet had 200 vessels designed specifically for war. Our smallest frigate had more firepower than his entire flotilla. "Then how did he pose any threat?" asked Vexmore, leaning forward. "That's exactly what Admiral Korvthak asked," Zethkar replied, right before Morrison did something that no military academy in the galaxy teaches, something that violates every rule of space combat we had learned in 3,000 years of warfare. The old warrior paused to drink, letting the tension build. Around them, the cantina continued its usual business, but their corner had become an island of focused attention. Morrison split his force into individual ships and sent them in 12 different directions, not retreating, not trying to escape. They were moving to attack positions around our fleet, positions that made no tactical sense according to our battle computers. "That's suicide," protested the young Krex officer whose name was Yexhol. "Dividing your force when facing superior numbers is the first mistake they teach you not to make." "Yes," Zethkar agreed. "That's what we thought too. Admiral Korvthak ordered our ships to pursue and destroy them one by one. Simple mathematics. Each of our battle groups had 20 times the firepower of a single human ship." His mandibles clicked softly. What we didn't understand was that Morrison wasn't trying to win a space battle. He was trying to buy time for something else entirely. What else? The ground forces were preparing something on the planet below. While we chased his ships around the outer system, the humans were turning their entire world into a trap. Zethkar's mechanical eye whirred as it adjusted focus. 3 days later, when we finally destroyed the last of Morrison's ships, we thought the real battle was over. We prepared for a simple ground assault against a demoralized population. But it wasn't over, Kethara said quietly. "No, it was just beginning." Zethkar finished his drink and signaled for another. "I was part of the first ground assault wave. 5,000 Vorthak shock troops, the best our military had ever trained. We had fought on 100 worlds, conquered dozens of species. We expected to face farmers with hunting rifles and maybe a few police officers with small arms. The server, a multi-armed creature whose species none of them recognized, brought Zethkar his drink and quickly moved away. Even aliens who had never heard the full story seemed to sense that something dark was about to be shared. The landing zone was a valley about 50 kilometers from their capital city. Our intelligence said it was agricultural land, mostly grain, farms with some livestock. Perfect for establishing a forward base before advancing on the main population centers. "Sounds like standard procedure," Yexhol commented. It was. Everything went according to plan for the first 10 minutes. Zethkar's voice grew quieter, forcing them to lean in to hear clearly. We landed, established a perimeter, began unloading heavy equipment. The valley was quiet, peaceful even. Green fields stretching in every direction, a few farm buildings. In the distance, no sign of enemy forces. Then what happened? The ground exploded. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Zethkar stared at his drink, the mechanical eye whirring constantly as if trying to process memories that still didn't make sense. Not just in one place, everywhere. The entire valley had been turned into one massive booby trap. Every field, every building, every piece of equipment the humans had left behind was rigged to explode. But it wasn't random destruction. It was carefully planned, perfectly timed. "How many did you lose?" Kithara asked. "In the first hour?" 3,000. Troops, most of our heavy equipment, all of our vehicles. His organic eye met hers. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was meeting the human who had done it. "You met the person responsible?" Her name was Lisa Hayes, Sergeant Lisa Hayes, though we didn't know her rank at the time. We found her in a farmhouse at the center of the valley, calmly treating wounded Vorthak soldiers who had been caught in the explosions. The young aliens exchanged confused looks. "She was helping your wounded?" "Yes." The same hands that had planted enough explosives to level half our landing force were now cleaning wounds and administering medical supplies from our own first aid kits. Zethkar's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of deep agitation among his species. When our commanders arrived to interrogate her, she offered to show them exactly how she had done it. "Why would she do that?" "Because she was proud of her work," Zethkar replied. "And because she wanted us to understand what we were really fighting." The mechanical eye focused on each of them in turn. Hayes had been a combat engineer before the war, but also a farmer. She knew every centimeter of that valley, every drainage ditch and irrigation pipe, every storage building and equipment shed. When the invasion began, she had 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to create that much destruction? Bexmore sounded skeptical. "She didn't create anything new," Zethkar explained. "She used what was already there. Fertilizer became high explosives. Irrigation systems became delivery mechanisms. Grain silos became fragmentation bombs. Every piece of farming equipment became a weapon." He paused to drink again, his movements showing the careful precision of someone who had learned to live with artificial parts. But the technology wasn't what made her dangerous. Any competent engineer could have done the same thing given enough time and resources. What made Hayes truly terrifying was her attitude. "What do you mean?" She treated warfare like a problem, to be solved, not a ritual to be performed. While we were following 3,000 years of military tradition, thinking about honor and proper tactics and rules of engagement, she was thinking about results, how to achieve maximum effect with minimum resources, how to turn every advantage we thought we had into a disadvantage. Zethkar's voice grew distant, as if he was seeing the past instead of the present. I watched her explain to General Thixvor, our ground commander, exactly how she had calculated the timing of each explosion, how she had studied our landing procedures from captured military manuals and predicted where we would place our equipment, how she had turned our own efficiency against us. What did the general say? Nothing. For the first time in his career, General Thixvor had nothing to say. He was a veteran of 50 campaigns, a master of ground warfare by any standard in the galaxy. But he was completely unprepared for an enemy who didn't follow the same rules he had spent his life learning. The cantina around them seemed to have grown quieter, though that might have been their imagination. Other patrons occasionally glanced in their direction, drawn by the intensity of Zethkar's voice even if they couldn't hear the specific words. Hayes wasn't the only one, Zethkar continued. As we advanced toward their capital city, we met more humans like her. Each one had found a different way to turn their civilian knowledge into military advantage. A construction worker named Pete Johnson had turned the city's subway system into a network of tunnels that let human forces appear and disappear like ghosts. A chemistry teacher called Mary Wilson had converted the high school laboratory into a factory for producing smoke, grenades and tear gas. Civilians fighting trained soldiers? That's what we kept thinking, Zethkar replied. We kept expecting to meet their real military, their professional soldiers who would fight according to proper rules. Instead, we found teachers and farmers, and shopkeepers who treated our invasion like any other problem that needed solving. His mechanical arm moved to touch the scars on his face. I got these from a 12-year-old human named Bobby Chen. He had rigged a bicycle to explode when someone tried to move it. Not because he was a soldier, but because he didn't want aliens in his neighborhood. A child did that. A child who had learned about chemistry from his mother, engineering from his father, and tactics from watching his older sister practice with the local defense force. Zethkar's mandibles clicked slowly. The humans didn't separate military knowledge from civilian knowledge the way we do. When war came, everyone became a warrior, but they all brought their own expertise to the fight. The young aliens sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were hearing. Everything they had learned about warfare, about the separation between soldiers and civilians, about the rules that governed civilized conflict, seemed to mean nothing when applied to humans. By the third night, word had spread through Station Epsilon 7 about the old Vorthak warrior telling war stories in the cantina. When the young officers arrived, they found nearly twice as many beings gathered around the nearby tables, all pretending to mind their own business while clearly listening for every word. Even some of the station's senior staff had found reasons to visit the cantina during what had become known as story time. Zethkar seemed unbothered by the larger audience. If anything, he appeared more focused, as if the presence of other veterans in the crowd gave weight to his words. Several older aliens nodded grimly at certain parts of his tale, their own scars and mechanical replacements suggesting they, too, had learned hard lessons about warfare. Colonel Danny Pierce, Zethkar began without preamble, settling into his usual chair. That name is still mentioned in Vorthak military academies, though not in the way you might expect. What was special about him? Asked Yexhol, the young Krex officer who had become the most vocal questioner in their group. Pierce commanded the defense of New Carthage, the colony's capital city. Population 400,000, mostly civilians. Our intelligence indicated minimal military infrastructure, standard civilian government buildings, basic police force, nothing that should have posed a significant challenge to our ground forces. Zethkar paused to order his drink, acknowledging several of the older aliens who had gathered to listen. A scarred Zilani female with burn marks across her neck scales gave him a respectful nod, which he returned. By the time we reached New Carthage, we had been fighting on Kepler 442b for 4 months. We had learned to expect human tricks and traps. Our soldiers were more careful, our advance slower but more thorough. General Thixvor had adapted our tactics based on what we had encountered in the rural areas. Had you learned to counter their methods? Kithara asked. We thought we had, Zethkar replied with bitter amusement. That was our first mistake. We assumed that humans would keep using the same tactics that had worked before. We prepared for booby traps, for converted civilian equipment, for irregular fighters hiding among the population. The mechanical eye whirred as it focused on the distance, as if seeing events from 15 years ago. What we found instead was something none of our military manuals had prepared us for. Pierce hadn't just organized the city's defense. He had organized the people themselves. What do you mean? Every person in New Carthage had a job in the defense plan. Not just the obvious ones like police officers and emergency workers. Everyone. School teachers became communications officers. Shop clerks became supply coordinators. Children became messengers and spotters. Elderly citizens became intelligence analysts. Vexmore frowned. That's not possible. You can't turn an entire civilian population into an effective military force in just a few months. That's what we thought too, Zethkar agreed. But Pierce wasn't trying to turn civilians into soldiers. He was trying to turn the entire city into a single, coordinated organism that could think and react as one unit. The old warrior leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a particularly disturbing memory. When we reached the city's outskirts, our scouts reported normal civilian activity. People going to work, children playing in parks, shops open for business. It looked like the city was continuing its normal routine despite the approaching army. They weren't evacuating? That's what puzzled us. Every other population center we had encountered either evacuated their civilians or gathered them in central locations for protection. New Carthage appeared to be ignoring our approach entirely. Zethkar's mandibles clicked slowly. General Thixfor decided to test their response by conducting a reconnaissance in force. 500 troops moving into the outer residential areas, expecting to encounter light resistance and gather intelligence about their defensive positions. What happened? Nothing. For 6 hours, our troops moved through empty neighborhoods, searching houses and checking potential ambush sites. They found no traps, no hidden weapons, no signs of military preparation, just normal family homes with normal family belongings. The mechanical parts of his body whirred softly as he shifted position. Then, at exactly noon local time, every human in the city disappeared. The young aliens exchanged puzzled looks. Disappeared? One moment our troops were reporting visual contact with civilians going about their daily business. The next moment, the streets were completely empty. 400,000 people had vanished in less than 10 minutes. That's impossible, protested Yexhol. Where could they have gone? Underground, Zethkar replied simply. Pierce had spent months connecting every basement, every storm drain, every utility tunnel, every subway station into a single network that ran beneath the entire city. When the signal came, the entire population moved into this underground system and effectively disappeared from our sensors. He paused to drink, letting the implications sink in. But that wasn't the clever part. The clever part was what happened next. Which was? Nothing continued to happen. For 3 days, our forces occupied a completely empty city. No resistance, no contact, no indication of where the population had gone or what they were planning. Our troops searched every building, every tunnel they could find, every possible hiding place. They found evidence that people had been there recently, but no people. Zethkar's organic eye focused on Cathara. General Thixavor grew more frustrated each day. He had brought enough firepower to level the city, but there was nothing to shoot at. He had troops trained for urban combat, but there was no one to fight. He had plans for dealing with civilian populations, but the civilians had simply ceased to exist. What was Pierce planning? Patience, Zethkar replied. Pierce was teaching us that humans could wait, while we grew more frustrated and more careless, while our troops began to relax because there was no apparent threat. The humans were watching and learning and preparing. The cantina had grown quieter as more beings strained to listen. Several older veterans moved closer, their expressions showing they recognized the tactical scenario being described. On the 4th day, Pierce made contact. Not through our communication systems, not through official channels. Every screen in the city suddenly showed his face. Every speaker began broadcasting his voice. The power grid, the water system, the traffic control network, everything connected to the city's infrastructure had been turned into a communication system. What did he say? He offered to negotiate, Zethkar said with dark amusement. General Thixfor was furious. Here was a human colonel surrounded by superior forces, his population hiding in tunnels like scared animals, offering to negotiate as if he held the stronger position. Did the general agree to meet? Yes, but only to demand immediate surrender. The meeting was set for the city's central plaza, neutral ground with clear sightlines in all directions. Thixfor brought a full company of guards and enough firepower to handle any treachery. Zethkar's mechanical eye dimmed slightly. Pierce came alone. Alone? One human, walking across an open plaza toward 500 armed Vortex soldiers. No weapons, no armor, no backup that we could detect. He looked like exactly what he was supposed to be. A defeated commander coming to surrender his forces. The old warrior's voice grew quieter. That's when we learned the most important lesson about human warfare. It's not about the weapons or the tactics or the technology. It's about psychology. What happened in the meeting? Pierce didn't come to surrender. He came to explain what he had done to our supply lines. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Around the cantina, several beings who had been listening leaned forward, sensing that the story was approaching its crucial moment. While we were searching for his population in the city, Pierce had been coordinating with human forces across the entire planet. Every supply convoy that had tried to reach us, every communication relay that connected us to the fleet, every piece of equipment we had landed outside the city. All of it had been systematically destroyed or captured. How? Remember, we weren't just fighting the people of New Carthage. We were fighting every human on Kepler 442b, and they were all connected through networks we didn't even know existed. While our attention was focused on the empty city, the humans had been dismantling our entire ground operation piece by piece. Zethkar's mandibles clicked rapidly. Pierce showed General Thixfor a tablet computer with real-time updates from across the planet. Our casualties, our supply losses, our communication failures, everything our own command staff was trying to hide from us, Pierce knew in detail. Then what? Then Pierce made his offer. He would allow our forces to withdraw from the planet, peacefully, with full honors and no pursuit. In exchange, we would acknowledge that the invasion had failed and agree to formal peace negotiations. What did your general say? Thixfor laughed. Even surrounded and cut off from supplies, we still had enough firepower to level the city and everyone in it. Pierce was one human making demands of an army that had conquered dozens of worlds. Pierce had done something that no military mind in the galaxy had ever conceived of. While we were busy following our traditional approaches to warfare, thinking about territory and supplies and tactical posé, by the fourth night, the cantina had been unofficially reserved for Zethkar's story. The station's manager, a practical being who understood profit, had quietly moved other entertainment to different venues and increased the drink prices. Nobody complained. Stories like this were rare enough that beings traveled between systems just to hear first-hand accounts of the human wars. Zethkar arrived to find nearly 100 aliens gathered in the space, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy. Military officers sat beside traders and diplomats. Veterans who had fought in other conflicts listened alongside young beings who had never seen combat. All united by curiosity about the species that had changed how the galaxy thought about warfare. The war ended 3 days after Protocol Omega. Zethkar began, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. Not because one side defeated the other, but because none of us understood what we were fighting anymore. He settled into his chair, the mechanical parts of his body making their usual soft sounds. The three fleets were too busy fighting each other to continue the invasion. The Vorthak Dominion recalled its forces to deal with what looked like betrayal by their allies. The Zelani fleet withdrew to protect their territory from Vorthak retaliation. The Krex hierarchy declared the entire operation a failure and blamed both other species for poor planning. So the humans won by default? Asked a new voice. A middle-aged Krex female had joined the regular group of young officers, her multiple eyes showing the careful attention of someone with actual combat experience. That's what we told ourselves, Zethkar replied. It was easier than admitting the truth. Which was that we had been outfought by what we considered a primitive species. That our 3,000 years of military experience meant nothing against enemies who didn't follow the rules we had spent centuries perfecting. Zethkar's organic eye focused on the Krex female. You're Commander Hexara, aren't you? 3rd Battle Group, Krex Hierarchy. You were there. I was a junior tactical officer then, she confirmed. I've spent the last 15 years trying to understand what went wrong. Then you know what I'm about to tell them, Zethkar said with grim recognition. About the real cost of fighting humans. He turned back to address the entire room. The immediate casualties were manageable. Each fleet lost perhaps 10% of its ships during the confusion of Protocol Omega. Repairs could be made. Equipment could be replaced. What couldn't be fixed was the damage to our understanding of warfare itself. How do you mean? Asked Vexmore, who had become quieter with each night's revelations. Every military doctrine we had developed was based on certain assumptions that enemies would behave rationally according to their best interests, that civilian and military functions were separate, that superior technology and numbers would eventually triumph, that warfare followed predictable patterns that could be studied and countered. Zethkar's mandibles clicked slowly. Humans broke every one of those assumptions. But you still had superior forces, protested Cathara. Even after the fleet separated, each one alone was still larger than anything humans could field. True, Zethkar agreed, but size doesn't matter when you're afraid to use your forces. Afraid? Think about what Pierce had accomplished. Using nothing but psychology and careful observation, he had turned 3 Allied fleets into enemies. If he could do that to military forces, what could he do to civilian populations? To trade networks? To diplomatic relationships that had taken centuries to build? The mechanical eye whirred as it scanned the crowd. The war officially ended, with a peace treaty signed on neutral ground, very formal, very proper, with all the traditional diplomatic language. But the real negotiation happened during a prisoner exchange. What prisoner exchange? I was captured during the final assault on New Carthage, Zethkar explained matter-of-factly, along with about 200 other soldiers from all 3 fleets. We expected to be held in standard military detention until the end of hostilities. That's not what happened. The humans didn't have standard military detention facilities. They had farming communities, manufacturing centers, research stations, all converted for wartime use but still fundamentally civilian in nature. So they did what humans do. They improvised. Zethkar's voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to lean in. We were housed in a converted agricultural college about 50 kilometers from New Carthage. The buildings had been dormitories for students learning farming techniques. The classrooms were still set up for lectures about crop rotation and soil management. How were you treated? Like guests who had overstayed their welcome, Zethkar replied with dark humor. The guards were mostly older humans, too young or too old for frontline combat, but still determined to do their part. They fed us meals from their own kitchens, provided medical care when we needed it, even organized recreational activities to keep us occupied. That sounds reasonable. It was. That's what made it so unsettling. His mechanical arm moved to touch the scars on his face. I kept waiting for interrogations, for demands for military intelligence, for some sign that they saw us as enemies to be exploited. Instead, they seemed genuinely interested in talking to us as individuals. About what? Everything except military matters. Our homeworlds, our families, our reasons for joining the military, cultural differences between our species, philosophy and art and music. One guard, an elderly human named Ben Cooper, spent hours teaching prisoners from different species how to play something called chess. Zethkar paused, his expression showing the confusion that still lingered 15 years later. Cooper had lost his left leg during the orbital bombardment phase of the invasion. His grandson had been killed in one of the early ground assaults. By every standard of warfare I understood, he should have hated us personally. But he didn't. He treated us like house guests he was trying to entertain. He showed us pictures of his family, told us stories about human history, asked thoughtful questions about our own cultures. He seemed genuinely curious about what made us different from humans. The cantina had grown so quiet that the hum of life support systems seemed loud. Everyone present was trying to process the idea of enemies treating each other with such casual courtesy. One day I asked him why. Zethkar continued. Why show kindness to beings who had invaded his world and killed his family? His answer haunts me still. What did he say? He said, we don't fight because we hate what's in front of us. We fight because we love what's behind us. Zethkar's mandibles clicked slowly. I asked him to explain what that meant. And Cooper told me that humans don't see warfare as a competition between enemies. They see it as a protection of everything they value. Their families, their way of life, their freedom to make their own choices. When those things are threatened, they fight with everything they have. But once the threat is removed, the anger disappears too. Commander Hexara nodded slowly. That's why they were so effective. They weren't fighting for conquest or glory or resources. They were fighting for survival itself. Exactly, Zethkar agreed. And that gave them a psychological advantage we never understood until it was too late. A Vorthak warrior fights for honor and expects his enemies to do the same. A Zelani pilot fights for territory and advancement. A Krek soldier fights because orders and logic demand it. What do humans fight for? Everything, Zethkar replied simply. Their children's future, their parents' safety, their right to exist, as they choose. When you threaten those things, you're not just fighting their military. You're fighting their entire civilization, and every individual in it becomes a potential weapon. Is that why the peace negotiations were successful? Asked a young Zilani officer who had been listening from the back of the room. The negotiations succeeded because we finally understood what we were really facing, Zethkar said. Not a primitive species that could be conquered through superior firepower, but a civilization that had turned adaptability and determination into art forms. What were the terms of the peace? Mutual recognition of territorial boundaries, trade agreements that benefited all parties, cultural exchange programs to prevent future misunderstandings, standard diplomatic language that could have been copied from 100 other treaties. Zethkar's organic eye focused on the distance, but there were also unofficial understandings, agreements that were never written down, but were clearly communicated during private conversations between military leaders, such as that human space would be left alone, that any future conflicts would be resolved through negotiation rather than force, that the three fleets would share intelligence about human capabilities to prevent other species from making the same mistakes we had made. And everyone agreed to this. Everyone was terrified not to agree, Zethkar said bluntly. We had seen what humans could accomplish when defending a single agricultural world with limited resources and obsolete equipment. The thought of facing their entire civilization with time to prepare and access to their full industrial capacity was nightmare fuel for military planners across the galaxy. He stood up slowly, his mechanical parts whirring. But the most disturbing part wasn't their effectiveness in combat. It was how quickly they forgave us afterward. On the fifth and final night, the cantina was completely packed. Word had spread beyond Station Epsilon 7 through subspace communications, and beings had arrived from neighboring systems just to hear the conclusion of Zethkar's tale. The station manager had to bring in extra seating and assign additional security to manage the crowd. Representatives from major galactic powers sat beside independent traders and mercenaries. Everyone wanted to understand how the human wars had changed the galaxy. Zethkar entered to find the crowd already waiting in respectful silence. His usual table had been reserved, with the best acoustics in the room so everyone could hear clearly. As he settled into his chair and ordered his drink, the quiet was so complete that the soft whirring of his mechanical parts seemed loud. 15 years, he began without preamble. 15 years since the Treaty of Kepler Station officially ended what historians now call the First Human War. 15 years to understand what we had encountered and what it meant for the future. He paused to look around the room, his organic eye meeting the gazes of beings from dozens of species. Some of you were there. Some of you have only heard rumors. All of you are here because you need to know what we learned. What did you learn? Asked Commander Hexara, who had become an unofficial spokesperson for the crowd's questions. That we had been living in a galaxy where we thought we understood the rules of power, Zethkar replied. Military strength, technological advancement, economic resources, territorial control. These were the factors that determined which species dominated and which ones submitted. Then humans appeared and made all of our calculations meaningless. His mechanical eye whirred as it focused on the young officers who had started this journey 5 nights ago. They looked older somehow, their confidence replaced by thoughtful uncertainty. 6 months ago, I attended the Galactic Security Conference on Arcturus Prime, Zethkar continued. Representatives from every major power discussing trade disputes, territorial boundaries, and resource allocation. Standard diplomatic business that has gone on for centuries. What made this conference different? Asked Vexmore, whose aggressive scales had remained neutral-colored throughout the week's revelations. The human representative, Zethkar said, simply. Ambassador Claire Stevens. The same Stevens from the war? The same Stevens who had been Colonel Stevens during the defense of Kepler 442b. The officer who designed the strategy that cost us thousands of lives and ultimately forced us to the negotiating table. His mandibles clicked slowly. She was sitting across from beings whose soldiers she had killed, whose fleets she had helped defeat, whose military doctrines she had proven obsolete. How did the other representatives react? With the kind of respect usually reserved for natural disasters, Zethkar replied with dark humor. Stevens wasn't just a diplomat. She was a living reminder of what humans could accomplish when pressed to their limits. He took a sip of his drink, the pause allowing the tension to build. The conference was supposed to address the Rigel sector, dispute between the Vorthak Dominion and the Zelani Federation. Both sides had been positioning fleets and making threats for months. War seemed inevitable. What was the human position on the dispute? That's what made Stephen so dangerous, Zethkar explained. She didn't take a position. Instead, she asked questions, simple, reasonable questions that exposed the flaws in everyone's arguments. What kind of questions? Why were both sides willing to spend enormous resources fighting over systems that were barely profitable to maintain? Had either side calculated the actual costs of military occupation versus the benefits of negotiated trade agreements? Were the disputed territories really worth the lives that would be lost fighting for them? Zethkar's organic eye focused on a scarred Zelani veteran near the front of the crowd. Admiral Korvthek, you were the Zelani representative. Tell them what happened when Stevens finished asking her questions. The Zelani admiral, whose neck showed the same kind of burn scars that marked many veterans of the human wars, spoke reluctantly. The entire dispute suddenly seemed pointless. Both sides were preparing to fight over territory that would cost more to hold than it was worth. Stevens hadn't argued for any particular solution. She had just made us think about what we were actually trying to accomplish, and within 3 days we had negotiated a resource-sharing agreement that gave both sides access to the disputed systems without requiring military occupation, the admiral continued. It was more profitable for everyone involved and eliminated the risk of casualties entirely. That's not unusual for diplomatic conferences, protested a young Krex officer from the back of the room. It's not unusual for humans, Zethkar corrected. What was unusual was seeing the same innovative thinking that made them so dangerous in warfare applied to peaceful problem-solving. Stevens approached the dispute the same way she had approached our invasion, by ignoring conventional wisdom and focusing on results. Is that why human space has become so influential? Asked Cathara. Partially, Zethkar agreed. But the real change is how other species now approach conflicts involving humans. Everyone remembers what happened the last time someone underestimated them. His mechanical arm moved to gesture at the crowd. Look around this room. How many of you serve in militaries that have added human warfare studies to their training programs? Nearly half the beings in the cantina raised hands or equivalent appendages. The percentage was higher among the obvious military personnel. How many of your governments have established formal diplomatic relationships with humanity since the war? This time, almost everyone responded positively. How many of you personally have served alongside human advisors or observers during military exercises? About a third of the crowd indicated they had such experience. That's the real legacy of Kepler 442b, Zethkar explained. Not the casualties or the territorial changes, but the fundamental shift in how the galaxy approaches conflict resolution. Everyone wants to understand how humans think, because everyone is terrified of facing them unprepared. Are humans really that dangerous? Asked a voice from the middle of the crowd. That's the wrong question, Zethkar replied. The right question is, are humans really that different from what we thought we understood about warfare? He stood, up slowly, his mechanical parts creating their familiar sounds. During the war, we kept expecting humans to behave like other species we had conquered. When they didn't, we assumed they were unpredictable or irrational. What we eventually realized was that humans weren't breaking the rules of warfare. They were following completely different rules that we had never encountered before. What rules? That every problem has a solution if you're willing to think creatively enough to find it. That conventional approaches are just starting points, not limitations. That the resources available to you include everything around you, not just the equipment designated for military use. His organic eye swept across the crowd. That the most important weapon in any conflict is the space between your ears. Is that why military academies now require human psychology courses? Partly, Zethkar confirmed, but also because we finally understood that humans don't separate military thinking from civilian thinking the way other species do. A human farmer thinks about crop rotation in the same systematic way that a human general thinks about troop deployment. A human engineer approaches building design with the same innovative mindset that a human tactician uses for battle planning. So, they're naturally better at warfare? They're naturally better at problem solving, Zethkar corrected. Warfare is just one type of problem. But when humans decide to solve the problem of military conflict, they bring the same creativity and determination that they use for everything else. Commander Hexara spoke up again. That's what makes them so valuable as allies, isn't it? The same qualities that made them dangerous enemies make them powerful friends. Exactly, Zethkar agreed. Human military advisors now serve with forces throughout the galaxy, not because they have superior technology or larger fleets, but because they think about problems differently than everyone else. What's the current status of human military capabilities? Asked Admiral Korvthek. That's the most frightening part of this story, Zethkar replied, his voice growing serious. During the war, we faced a small portion of humanity defending their homes with limited resources and obsolete equipment. We never encountered their main military forces operating at full capacity with unlimited resources and time to prepare. The cantina became completely silent. This was the revelation many had come to hear. Current intelligence estimates suggest that the forces we fought on Kepler 442b represented less than 1% of humanity's actual military potential. Zethkar continued. The humans we faced were farmers and teachers and shopkeepers with basic training and improvised weapons. Their professional military never fully engaged, their industrial capacity was never fully mobilized, their research institutions never focused entirely on weapons development. How much stronger could they be? Someone asked in a hushed voice. We don't know, Zethkar admitted. And that uncertainty is what keeps peace in the galaxy. Every major power has reached the same conclusion. Humans are too dangerous to fight and too valuable to antagonize.